Hello and welcome to my CCT tutorial about connections, specifically about this tab right here. So I'm gonna show you how to make connections between your inputs, your programming modules, and your outputs. Alright, so first of all, I would like to assume that you have a basic understanding of the type of objects that we have in CCT. Those are Boolean, enum, and float, and those can be inputs and outputs. And if you're not familiar, you can check out my other video where I explain those in more detail. Okay, so now I want you to pay attention at my bottom window, the connections tab. Just remember that when you open CCT, the parameters tab is the one that is active by default. So just click on connections and see how this window updates as I click on my inputs, my outputs, or any of my programming modules. Let's start with the programming modules. So I'm going to click on occupancy status and see how that name is shown here, occupancy status, right? And you see that there's an input here and an output, and there's more stuff going on here, a source and a destination. But let's just focus on the middle part, the yellow and the light blue, my inputs and outputs. So I'm going to right click on my module, go to view logic, and you can see what's inside. I have a yellow input, which is the same as here, and a light blue output right here. Going back to my control tab, if I click on the next module, set point selection, you see that it's a little bit more interesting. We have 3 inputs and we have 2 outputs, but they have the same name. So this is a tricky part. So let's go and see what's inside here. So I'm gonna right click, view logic, and you can see that we have 3 inputs and they are exactly the same as here, but only 1 output. So this means that my outputs can be connected multiple times. Now let's see what's connected to all these 3 inputs. So if we look at the bottom part, my connections, you can see that my first input, OCC-CMD, is connected to this block and port, which is my source, right here. My OCC-set is connected to RMT-set, which is a different name, but both have the same name on the block and port. So let's go back to control, and I'm gonna click on this blue block that is like a link. So if I click on it, it's actually showing me where it's coming from. It's coming from a network input called OCC-CMD, occupancy command. And you can see that this updates. So if I go back to my set point selection, this updates again, and I can trace what's my occupancy set point, which is connected to something called RMT-set, which stands for room temperature set point. So I'm going to click on it. It's right here. It's a network input. That's my room temperature set point. And finally, if I go back to my set point selection and click on the last input, ANOC RMT set, which again is another network input. Now let's trace my outputs. So if I click on set point selection, we know that we have 1 output, right? If I click here, we have only 1 output, but it's connected to 2 places, right? So going back to control, you can see that this output is connected to a destination. So the destination has a block and a port. Okay, so let's trace the second connection because that's the simplest one. You can see that it has a block and a port. They both have the same name. If I click on it, you can see that is connected to a network output, actual room set point. All right. So going back to my set point selection, let's look at the other one. The first one, system run logic, which is the block name, and the port ACT-set, actual set point. So if I click on it, it's actually going into this block. So now you may start getting the idea. So now under this block, you can see that it's right here, system run logic, and this block again, it has its own inputs and its own outputs. So one of its input is actual set point, which we just find out that is connected to my set point selection output. So going back to set point selection, which is this guy, you know, one of his outputs is actually connected to this block, which is this guy, and this block has an input called actual set point. So if I click on it, this gets highlighted, and you can see that here's my actual set point as an input. And that's how you kind of trace all inputs and outputs on all modules. Now, one last thing I want to show you before we actually start making connections, because all this is already connected. So it's looking at my network inputs or inputs and my outputs. So if I click, let's say on at my room temperature set point, you can see that it follows the same pattern. It's supposed to have an input, has an output, and is connected to something. So for my network inputs, most of them are not really ever going to be connected to anything on my left side, because these are inputs. So these are kind of meant to be connected to something on the right hand side, right? Like my set point, you know, is going to my destination set point selection. So, and let's look at an actual input. Let's say my zone temperature or room temperature. Same thing. Its output is connected to some block and a port, or the block's input. On the other hand, if we look at my outputs, let's say occupancy status, this is kind of the opposite. You have connections coming from a source, because these are outputs. So basically we have a occupancy block, which is right here. So it's an occupancy status. So basically its output goes to this network output. So that's why this network output only has connections on the input side. Same thing with my hardware output. Let's say my exhaust fan start stop. Something is telling it to start. So there's gonna be a source, right? So nothing on the right hand side. Okay, let's now start making connections. So I'm going back to my set point selection module, and you know, everything is connected. I'm going to right click on my input. I got two options. I'm gonna break the connection, and you can see that this goes blank. Right click, break, and you notice this yellow triangle. I'm gonna right click and break. So all my three inputs are not connected anymore. And let me show you what this yellow triangle means. So it means that this block does not have any destination connections. So you can tell that nothing is connected to these two set points. Now, same thing with my outputs. I right click on it. I'm gonna go break connection. Right click, break connection. Okay, so now I actually disconnected everything from the entire application. So if you can see, there are no connections anywhere, right? So you can see everything is blank. Okay, so quick reminder, it is very important that you understand the three types of objects that we have: Boolean, enum, and float. And very quick, Boolean, they have the values of true and false, nothing else. Float is actually objects that have numbers like 1, 2, 3 or decimal numbers. So that's float. Everything else can be considered enum or enumerators. Those will be off on, start stop, occupied unoccupied. So basically states. So being that said, let's get started. So set point selection. So I'm gonna make my first connection, occupancy command. So if you look on the right hand side, you can kind of tell that this is an enumerator, right? Unoccupied, occupied. These guys are numbers, so float, and this is another float, right? So I'm gonna right click on it and make connection. That's the only option I have, so easy, make connection. So you're gonna have this new window, and I guess the only option that you have is my occupancy command, so which is coming from my network inputs right here, occupancy command. I'm just gonna click OK, and you get your first connection. Okay, so this was one way of doing it. So basically we went from my block to my source, right? So we can actually go from this block to a destination. So let's try that. I'm gonna right click and break the connection. So I'm gonna go to this input, and this, you know, becomes my block. So I'm gonna go to this, from this block to a destination. So that will be on this side. So right click, make connection, and well, actually I have two options, right? So let's select the set point selection, occupancy command input. So okay, so that's how you make that connection. So I'm gonna click over here, and you see that it's right there. So going back to my occupancy command, you know, as I told you before, we can make multiple connections. So I know that this also goes to my occupancy status logic. So I'm gonna right click on it. I can make more connections. So this is what is left, occupancy status, its input, click OK, and I got my connection. So if I try to connect it to something else, make connection, you can see no blocks with matching criteria found. So that means that there's nothing else with the same units, because these are enumerators. Now coming back to my set point selection, you see that we have this connection made. So let's start with the next one. The next one is my occupancy set point, which is a number, and most of our objects are gonna be numbers. So I'm gonna go right click and make connection, and now it gets more interesting. You have more options, but we know that my occupancy set point is actually my room temperature set point, which is a network input. So basically I'll look for my network inputs right here. So room temperature set point, and it gets, and this gets picked by default. So I'm just gonna click OK. Same thing with my unoccupied set point. Right click, make connection, look for that network input, and you can also type here, you know, unoccupied, unocc, and there you go. It kind of filters out. Click OK, and you got it. For my output, right click on my actual room temperature set point, make connection. Also multiple options, because these are numbers, you know, most of the stuff is gonna be numbers, so you gotta know where you're actually connecting. First of all, I know that this was going to this guy, so it's a network output. So I'm just gonna click on it, make sure it's selected, click OK. Okay, so I also know that this output was connected to some of my logic here. So I know that it was connected to my system run logic. If I click on it, there's an input called actual set point. So I can even make the connection from here, you know, make connection and look for that, you know, set point selection, which is under my set point and miscellaneous column. So, you know, I can look for it right here, and set point selection right here. It's right there, right? We create the connection. Or the other way, let's break it, you know, going back to my set point selection, and I know that my output goes to here, right? So I'm gonna right click on it, make connection, and you gotta know what you're doing. So I know this is under my state generation column, so state generation right here, system run logic, and we actually have two options or two inputs, right, that are compatible, right? These are two inputs or floats, numbers. So I know that this is the guy. So I tend to type similar names so we don't get lost. But in this tutorial, I put different names so you can know, so you know that you can actually have different names all around. But okay, so my system logic and the input actual set point. Click OK, and there you go. We completed our set point selection module connections. And now to finalize, I want to show you Boolean connections and a few more enumerator connections. So I know that my system run logic has an output that is Boolean. So I can tell by the status here, which is false. And remember that Booleans are true and false. So I'm going to right click on my output and I want to connect that to some of my modules. So exhaust fan run, so I know this is a Boolean. So, and CCT is only gonna show you compatible outputs or inputs. So I know this also has two Boolean values, but I know that we're looking for the run. So, and finally, last connection is to system run. So this is just a status right here. So those are my Boolean connections, true and false. Now this system run logic block has a input called shutdown, which has some units, a shutdown unit. So I'm gonna right click on it, make a connection, and I only got one option, which is my input emergency stop. So click on it, and okay, you're gonna notice when we're connecting to inputs that you're gonna have this strange name. I'm still gonna make the connection. Now for room temperature, I'm gonna do the same thing. Right click, make connections, and I know that my room temperature is actually this guy, zone temperature. They can have different names. So it's right here. And same thing, we have O1 and priority. So I'll explain you that super quick. Click OK. Okay, so you see how my programming blocks have inputs and outputs, and they have a name right here. So those names are these guys, right? Okay, so if I go to my hardware inputs, let's say zone temperature, it doesn't have any more inputs because this is the input. But it does have an output. Its value is considered the output, which is connected to the logic. So its output has a name of O1, output 1. So there's people that don't like this because it can get confusing. If I see where it's connected, my zone temperature and its output, which is named as O1, is connected to my logic room temperature input, right? So we can actually change this guy if we don't like it. So if I go to my input, go to edit, there's nothing on inputs, because there's nothing here. But the name, you can change that name as, let's say, RM-T, right? I'll apply, click closed, and now you can see that my zone temperature has an output name of RM-T. So if I go back to my system run logic, you can see that this makes more sense, right, than O1. And similar thing with my outputs. Let's see, my exhaust and start stop, it has the value of stop, that's the units, but it has an I1. So remember, this is kind of the opposite. So it's, it's considered an input on this end of my output. So this is actually connected to this module. But let's make the connection from here. So I'm gonna right click on it, make connection. That's the only output available that has stop start units, so I1. So this is what we don't like to see, right? So some people like to double click on all the inputs and outputs and rename them, you know, to something that makes sense. So I'm gonna do ef-ss as start stop, apply, and close. So now he has something that a name that makes sense. So I'm gonna click on this module. I'm gonna make the connection, and only option available, exhaust ef start, which that's its name, internal name, ef start stop. Click OK, and that's your connection. Okay, so one very last thing. Let's say you have all your connections done and you notice that you made a wrong connection. You don't have to break the connection and change it, you know, and make it again. So you can actually change it. So I'm gonna click on change. So it automatically breaks it. And, you know, let's say, just for this example, I can change it to a zone humidity and click OK. And that's how you change your connections. All right, so this is the end of my basic connections tutorial. I really hope that you get a better understanding of how connections work, how to trace them, how to make new connections, and I will see you on the next video. Thank you very much.